Hi, I'm Chelsea Powers, and I'm a technical consultant here at Solstice Mobile.
And I'm Jeremy Conk, and I'm also a technical consultant here at Solstice. So today we're talking about iOS frameworks. And just to cover high level, what is an iOS framework? Well, to put it simply, it's a library that's pre-compiled, and included with that are public headers, which your application can interface with, and any resources, any image or language files that need to go along with that.
And just a note on that, frameworks have been around since the beginning of iOS and OS, but developers haven't actually been able to create their own frameworks and add them to their own projects. So what does frameworks mean for developers? It basically frameworks give us the overhead to share code between developers and on projects is much lower. So similar to CocoaPods, but the user doesn't see what's going on under the hood as much. And it's great. The frameworks are great within large organizations because different code bundles are easy to package and access code across different projects. So frameworks can be shared across your extensions as well. So in iOS 8, we now have extensions in our applications. So there's one app submission with two different targets.
So it's a target for the application and a target for the extension?
Correct, yes, correct. So the contents of a framework, you've got your views, your controls, custom appearances, view controllers, service API, and then other resources. So any repetitive elements within your project can be pulled out into that framework and shared across.
Something you said about frameworks being around for most of iOS. The iOS SDK is basically an amalgamation of frameworks. The operating system itself is reasonably lean, a little larger with iOS 8. I think it's around 2 gigs. However, we've seen over 1 million applications in the App Store through the use of the iOS SDK and the frameworks that are available to developers. And now Pandora's box has been opened for we as the dev team to contribute back to that bundle of frameworks. Obviously not in the iOS SDK, but in whatever way we choose to distribute them. So when we're creating frameworks, this isn't a catch-all solution for shared code. There's the right and wrong time to do it. I'd say when your code is very encapsulated, when the logic is testable, particularly by unit test, because this is something that's ubiquitous across applications, and there's not one right answer for your application to be using it. And when functionality is extensible for future applications to use, I think that's a good scenario to consider taking that logic and packaging it within a framework that you can distribute across your projects and across your application.
Right. Also a note on testing, with frameworks, all the code that you write within the frameworks, they are difficult to actually test because you can't just take a framework and test the code written in there. It has to be leveraged within an application. So your QA, they all are going to have to test the framework within the context of an app.
Absolutely. And of course, there are some scenarios where we don't want to put logic in frameworks. I'd say when requirements are changing very often and you don't have a stable, consistent code base, and when the code depends heavily on application logic that is specific to a certain application, I don't think that we need to pull that into a common layer and share it via frameworks just for the sake of doing it. I think we need to be judicious about when we do this. That being said, I think more common is the case where we're copying and pasting code rather than thinking, hey, I should really be sharing this across a framework. So I think the when to do it are more likely to be ignored than the when not to. So prior to Xcode 6, it wasn't impossible to make frameworks, but there was a lot of overhead there. You had to create this dynamic library, export your headers publicly, mimic the directory structure of iOS frameworks, do the hokey pokey, and all these steps were involved. Therefore, you didn't see a lot of frameworks distributed, and people tended to favor CocoaPods or other ways of sharing code. With Xcode 6, it's really straightforward. You just create a framework project and export, and you're good to go.
Yeah, and some gotchas when you're developing and using frameworks. You're going to copy your framework into the apps directory. Some different things to know is that your framework is versioned, so you don't have to be running the exact same framework on all your applications. You can version
because the framework itself
apps.
is embedded in your app's binary,
Right.
instead of living on the operating system.
Exactly. And in your framework, you're going to want to implement just common Apple protocols, as you commonly would within your application. You want to have your API, this is very important, you want to have your API match Apple's naming conventions, to just not have a lot of confusion between other developers picking up your framework and using it. It looks like Apple, they know how to use it, functions like Apple, hopefully. And it's just better to be verbose in your naming conventions than brief. That way, other developers can understand exactly what's going on within your methods, how to use them.
Thanks for joining us at Solstice for another 5 good minutes.